Hi, this is Arnie Arneson, and this is the Thursday edition of The Attitude with Arnie Arneson and producers Dave Scott and Stephanie Collins. And of course, as you know, we're recording on a very brisk Wednesday morning. So I can't believe this, everyone, but this is year 4, count them, 1, 2, 3, 4, of Race Class with Jonathan Feingold. And way back when, in January, a couple of years ago, we wrote the following: legislation restricting the teaching of race and racism in public schools and government entities has spread across the country. In an effort to respond, Boston University law professor Jonathan Feingold and The Attitude's Arnie Arneson are offering Race Class, a once-a-month conversation where listeners can hear what it's like to approach race and racism from a place of curiosity and history, rather than fear and anxiety. This show is made available on the Pacifica Network and also on my show, and of course, anywhere that you can grab your podcasts. And you said this at the very, very end of the press release. In describing the foundational purpose of Race Class, Jonathan Feingold noted, "We know race matters. Part of this project is to make sense of what that means." Welcome back, Jonathan. Thank you so much for doing this. And in some ways, as I said to you the other day, we need this class now more than ever. More than ever.
It's good to see you too, Arnie. I
Are you
don't
worried?
disagree.
Are you worried? I mean, I know this is what you teach. I know you're teaching in Massachusetts, in Boston, but I am thinking of professors like you in places that will not be as sort of quote unquote safe. Places like Florida, places like Texas, places like Iowa, where these people have been invested in teaching and empowering and exploring these issues and educating these young students to sort of ask questions, to sort of explore what they're learning and to question what they're learning. My father, who was an ultra conservative, always told me to question authority. And I remember at one point I looked at him and I said, "You realize, Papa, that means questioning you." I mean, it's just so true. But as I'm looking at it, you must be talking to other professors that are basically in your area of expertise. And what are those conversations like, Jonathan, right now with the Trump administration going after everything that not only you teach, but that you try to sort of bring into the public sphere?
So I think it would be delusional to not be deeply concerned right now. I think every educator in the country who is invested in equipping students with, an arsenal of critical thinking skills is deeply concerned. In part because there is, it's not new, the attacks on higher education or K through 12 education, but it is certainly ascendant in a particular way. And as we were talking about before we came on, Florida is a model that no doubt the Trump administration will try to nationalize. And it's a model in which you have had essentially an authoritarian takeover of K through higher ed education in the state. Some prominent examples like the DeSantis takeover of New College of Florida, which had been, just a bastion of open inquiry, critical thought, and, like a really sort of inclusive atmosphere. That was totally snuffed out. In order to essentially, to do a whole lot of things, but to experiment with how to create sort of right-wing, education, not even the right word, but, just sites of power that are meant to serve narrow interests as opposed to the common good. And the last thing that, I guess, two more things, just off the cuff reactions, and then we'll get into the conversation a little bit more. So the first, another way in which uh, the attacks on attacks on education that we'll see that we've already seen from the Trump administration that are employing a very divisive, hateful sort of rhetoric, targeting students of color, targeting the LGBTQ community, targeting immigrant students. Like that is a tactic that DeSantis leaned into
Hmm.
in ways that, were very like unapologetic um, and brazen. And part because there is a sort of, at least part of the attacks are part of a like deeply sort of deep nostalgia for an America that was a pre-civil rights America, in which we were like governed by all sorts of racial and gender hierarchies, in which there was, far less room to critique them. But the Florida example is also about grift. It is about it's about how you take everyone's money through taxes and redistribute it to your friends.
Yes.
And so, in the Florida example, that could include um, the sorts of school vouchers that are like essentially funneling money to wealthy parents who already have their kids in uh, private schools, often that are religious schools that may engage in various forms of discrimination. That and and so it is a moment in which we will see broader efforts to um, force us all through our tax dollars to subsidize and to pay for and prop up institutions that, like, contrary to working, like being um, animated by a interest in the common good, even if we're never actually like fully realizing that, but like committed to like a deeply exclusionary sort of politics and a hierarchical sort of society. Um, and so yeah, so Florida's a model for what we're going to see, and it both is going to involve the sorts of brazen attacks on any sort of non like historically mainstream family structure, racial identity, um, religion, but then again, also the grift. The grift is huge here and just trying to pull public money into anti-democratic projects in order to prevent a like, meaningful sort of democratic accountability.
But it's not even democratic. The word grift is so important and we don't use it. And we don't use it. So as you were talking, I actually typed in those words and I saw an opinion piece entitled A Deceptive Dish, the School Voucher Grift. We've never really talked about that when we were talking about school vote. We're talking about public dollars going into people who don't need them. We're talking about religious schools. We're talking about resegregating schools. We've talked about all these things, but the grift piece is actually should be front and center, Jonathan. Because again, I think people don't want to see that they don't want to see some person enriching themselves with your public dollars and your kid doesn't get the benefit of better education. So some guy's
And
richer. I mean, we don't talk about the grift and almost every single thing that you see happening right now with Donald Trump, with the deregulation, with Doge, with vouchers, with all this stuff. If the heart and center, if you peel the onion back at the center is the grift. It isn't anti-democracy. It's actually pro-grift.
and you see, and we can think about grift in a few different ways.
Oh my God.
One is just the self-dealing that we know that one of the reasons why, or at least it seems quite apparent that one of the reasons why Trump is so excited about, another presidency is not just avoiding criminal liability, but because it opens door for all sorts of self-dealing.
Right.
I think there's like Judd Legum had some piece out today about how I think it was, one of the Trump kids got a ton of money from Saudi Arabia, and that money is now getting funneled back to Trump and is building a big Trump tower in Serbia. So there's a lot of that, but also like it's important, like I think, to think about grift not as just that sort of self-dealing, but also the stranglehold that oligarchs now have over American society, just the ultra, ultra wealthy many of whom were at the inauguration, who control most of the important institutions that are like ostensibly sort of democratically inclined institutions, democratic in sort of the self-governance sense, whether it's um, uh, media institutions, whether it's big newspapers, what have you. So, and this is a race class episode. Uh, and so part of the question is, okay, well, what's race got to do with it? And there's a number of ways that we can enter, sort of start talking about that. One is just to, you know, so there's um, so Derek Bell, who is sort of rightly identified as one of the, um, uh, sort of foundational thinkers that from whom generated this field that we think of as critical race theory, talked about the permanence of racism.
Hmm.
So, it is this descriptive claim that racism is permanent in the United States, which is not to say that the way in which racism manifests is um, static and unchanging, but that racism is actually fundamental to the fabric of this country. And it is hard to imagine a United States that is free from racism. Now, that's an empirical claim that, our institutions should like have, um, create opportunities for folks to contest it. Certainly during the Obama years, we were having all these conversations about whether or not we're quote unquote post-racial.
Yes.
I think that, we no longer have to have those conversations. But it's one thing to say, okay, racism is permanent, but it's another thing to be like, okay, well, what does that actually mean
Yeah.
and why? And so one might be that particular sort of racial ideologies, including sort of anti-blackness, that were forged hundreds of years ago through laws that associated blackness with a presumption of being enslaved. That and all of this sort of narrative surrounding that it's actually seeped into the ideology of the country in a way where like we expect racial hierarchy or we expect racial inequality because of the way in which racist structures how we think about the world. But there's never just one answer to any of these questions. And another reason why one could say racism is permanent, or at least thus far has, uh, been part of the fabric of this country, is because it is a super effective political
Tool.
tactic
Yeah.
tool.
Yeah. Tool.
And you could say for whom? Like who does it benefit? And it benefits a lot of folks who are like in the grift game. And again, we can think about grift in a whole lot of ways. But so, in I think the last conversation you were just having, um, at least what I caught in the end was a critique of the Biden or Harris, I don't know if it was Biden administration or Harris campaign, for failing to recognize that the system is not working for most people. Which could be, that rent is skyrocketing, that health insurance is insane, that, um, that prices are out of control, whatever sort of big economic metrics might suggest we're moving in okay direction, that the sort of fundamental sort of economic order of the United States means that most people live in constant precarity, where life is impossibly hard. Um, and so then the question is, how's racism play into that? Well, for Trump, he does not shy away from the precarity. He does not deny that the country is crushing most of the people who live in it. But how does he explain that? Does he say, well, you know what, the culprits are these oligarchs, these corporations that, dictate your wages, dictate your living conditions, dictate the sort of environmental regulations? Of course, he doesn't go there. He says it's immigrants.
Yeah.
He says it's DEI.
Yeah.
He says it's all these sort of other people who are racialized in one way or another that are responsible for your precarity. That's
and
it.
what I don't understand is that that mythology, that statement, those connection of the dots, that's been going on for decades. Okay, that the Republican Party, the Heritage Foundation, Rush Limbaugh, the Christian evangelical movement, whatever. I am just trying to figure out why is it that I am called woke because I am trying to say that's a freaking lie. Okay, that doesn't happen. And Jonathan, you've heard me tell this story over and over again. I'm going to tell it again because in some ways it really sort of highlights what you said. I'm running for Congress. It's 1996. I go up to a very, very poor community in northern New Hampshire. By the way, I was the president of the second largest employer in northern New Hampshire, which was a poverty program. Okay. Okay. So I understood where they were coming from. And I walked into the room and I'm running in some ways against Bill Clinton. I'm running against his Welfare Reform Act. I'm running against his Criminal Justice Act. I'm running against, the deregulation of derivatives. So in a lot of ways, who am I? I'm running against my own president. And I walk into this room, Jonathan, and this guy says to me, "We hate you, Arnie Arnesen." And I looked at him and I said, "Really, have we met?" Okay. And the room is filled with a lot of guys that used to work in the paper mills, that used to work in the timber industry. And they said, "You just want to protect those welfare women. We hate you." And I said, I said, "So tell me why." And the guy says to me, "Arnie, we work 50 and 60 hours a week and we can't go to a doctor when we're sick. We work 50 and 60 hours a week and we can't afford our rent. We work 50 and 60 hours a week and no one's helping us with pre-K. All right. And those welfare women, look what they have. All right." And I looked at them and I said, "I'd be ticked off too." I said, "But I have two questions for you. How does taking it away from those welfare women get it for you? And then there's another question. It doesn't sound like there's something wrong with welfare. It sounds like there's something wrong with work. Because when you can work 50 hours and you can't afford your groceries, it ain't welfare that's taking it away from you. It's work. When you can work 50 hours a week and can't go to a doctor when you're sick, it ain't those welfare women that's doing it. There's something wrong with work." So we have known for a long time that we have to address a lot of the things that you were talking about. But what they do is they cover it with a culture war conversation in order to protect what is ultimately happening, which is both a class war and grift. And yet, how come we never, ever find our voice to explain it? So we're now in a position of a Donald Trump. And my asking the question to Professor Feingold, are you frightened? Are you worried because of this war on basically everything that you've been teaching for decades?
So again, it'd be delusional not to be frightened and worried because it's not just an assault on teaching, it's an assault on people and an
Yes,
assault on communities.
right, right.
It is an assault on one's ability to live with dignity and to, dissent from like the government. So one of the Trump sort of the first Trump anti-CRT executive order from 2020 that certainly will be reinstated in one form or another. In the list of prohibited divisive concepts, number two was that the United States is fundamentally racist or sexist. And, so it is an administration that is going to try to take off the table the ability to critique the status quo in all sorts of ways. But the common sense to it is, the communications campaign strategy that you have just referenced, which is for the past 50 years,
Yes,
at least since the
yes,
1970s,
exactly.
the sort of the sort of through line from groups like the Heritage Foundation, though certainly not alone, um, is that, well, all the problems in American society are due to this civil rights overreaction, um, which also trade on all sorts of gendered and racial stereotypes. And so, like, you're talking about sort of like alluding to quote unquote welfare queen tropes. Th Most people in the United States who benefit from any sort of welfare have always been white,
I
just
know.
as in raw numbers. Um, but there is a way in which um, just pervasive racial tropes, stereotypes, caricatures are embedded within the American imagination that make it easy to scapegoat particular group um, even if it's, divorced from any sort of empirical reality. But there's another piece to this, Arnie. So you're talking about communication strategy from the right. That's been really effective. That's been honed, and there's nothing new about it. But Arnie, what has like been the counter? What's the counter narrative? Or is it who, like when have we consistently heard some, so if we're saying this is the right, who's the mainstream, the major institutions on the left that have been countering the argument that that
I
you
know.
have to take into account all of these characteristics, race, gender, etc., if you want a fair and meritocratic system, because of all the ways in which um, society works. If you close your eyes to all of the forces, interpersonal, intergenerational, institutional, that systematically overvalue the performance of someone from sort of a mainstream group, which, white guy is sort of in the center of that, the system is going to be anti-meritocratic
Yes.
because that's what it was, that's what it's always been. And so I'll give you just a more concrete example here, because I think there is or at least I assume, there's not a ton of surprise that the Walmarts of the world or the Amazons of the world are backing off of their quote unquote DEI commitments. Because those commitments only really materialized in the summer of 2020 when there was massive protests and it became, from a business perspective, impossible not to at least performatively show some sort of commitment to dealing with racism in the United States. What about Harvard? So Harvard, we've talked a lot about Harvard. So Harvard was at the center of national attention because it was embroiled in litigation over the constitutionality of its very modest race-conscious admissions practices. And Harvard could have used that moment as an example to say that in the interests of the Constitution, morality, fairness, and merit, we have to take into account who a student is. Because we know that the way in which racism operates in this country, no one is actually untouched by it. Now, does that mean we can sort of identify in the a super precise way, how everyone has been touched? The answer is of course not. But to the extent we are not attending to forces that continue to structure American society in an admissions process, then it means we're going to continue essentially granting preferential treatment to those students who have the most inherited advantage, which doesn't make them the best surgeons or pilots. It just means they get to inflate their resumes.
Right.
And to the extent we care about actually ensuring that our planes are flown by the best pilots and our hospitals have the best surgeons and, you know, what have you, that means that we have to make sure that we are actually getting in here the folks who are, the quote unquote best and brightest, if that is our mission, which Harvard says it is. I don't know if that's what it should be. And to the extent Harvard is, consistently over admitting students who just inherited advantage from their parents, which is not the same thing as even um like preparation, because we know from the litigation that Harvard was very comfortable admitting wealthy white legacy applicants whose SAT scores were below the mean. But again, just the point is that there has not been a count, like the only folks really who are consistently saying race matters, gender matters, all these other sort of structures matter in ways that if we don't account for them, that's not neutrality. That's simply a form of advantage that we're just letting sort of dictate how things go, like,
Well, I'm going to have to let you go, but what I'm thinking is that the definition of merit under the Trump administration is white and male. Because you start with the understanding that's the lens through which merit is now determined. They use the term of art, but they don't actually follow through, Jonathan. They don't. And I want to go back. I got to let you go, but your comment about grift. Your comment about grift, we have to talk about that more and more and more because that is going to define the next 4 years. And they'll package it in a lot of different ways. But in the end, when you peel it all back, it ends up being at the heart and the center of virtually everything that this administration will do. This is the 4th year, everyone, of Race Class with Jonathan Feingold. You hear us on the 4th Thursday of every month. You can hear it on the Pacifica Network, also on your podcast. Thank you so much for holding my hand, and we're going to need to sort of learn from each other even more in the next couple of months and years. So again, thank you for doing this.
Thanks, Arnie.
You're welcome. This, everyone, is a Thursday edition of The Attitude. We will schmooze tomorrow, everyone. Ciao.